Hello everyone, welcome to Unique History Channel. Today we'll be reading from Bible and Sword, England and Palestine from the Bronze Age to Balfour, and we'll be reading the Crusades. To be the sewer of Christendom and drain all the discords out of it was the primary function of the Crusades. The Reverend Tom Fuller said in his History of the Holy War, written in 1639, admittedly a partisan Protestant view, Fuller's dictum can still stand without some serious challenge. At the onset, the Crusades were set in motion by a thirst for gain, for glory, and revenge upon the infidel in the name of religion. Exulting in bloodshed, ruthless in cruelty, innocent of geography, the strategy or supply, the first Crusaders plunged headlong eastward, with no other plan of campaign than to fall upon Jerusalem and wrest it from the Turks. This in some mad fashion they accomplished only one, because the enemy was divided against himself. Therefore, after mutual dissension defeated them too, even the most elementary loyalty among allies that ought to have been dictated by a sense of self-preservation was lacking for the next 200 years. The trail of their forked peons across the heart of the Middle Ages was but a series of vain endeavors to recapture the victories of the first expedition. Failure seemed to have taught them nothing. Like human lemmings, each generation of crusaders flung themselves into the fatal footsteps of their fathers. Palestine itself, the battleground, the prize, became a second country, if not a graveyard for half of the families of Europe. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Second Crusade, boasted that he left one man in Europe to console every 7 widows. But what made the distant land so familiar was not the numbers who went at any one time, so much as the fact that they kept going over and over again to the same place for nearly 2 centuries, so that often 2 or 3 or 4 generations in the same family had fought or settled or died in Palestine. In England, the carved stone effigies of 4 eagles of Oxford, which the cross legs signifying a participant in the Crusades, lie in the parish church at Hereford. Abricus de Vere, the first Earl, surnamed the Grim, in full battle dress and chain mail, from head to toe, covered by a cloth surplice, sorted aside, spurred feet resting on a lion, lies in stony immortality on a tomb bearing the date 1194. Near him are the 2nd Earl, died in 1215, the 3rd Earl died in 1221, and the 5th Earl died 1295, each with the crossed legs of the Crusader. Similarly, in Aldworth Church in Berkshire, there are 5 crossed effigies of the de la Biche family. Such effigies can be found in every country in England, some with feet resting on a boar or a stag, some with a hand on a sword, half pulled from its scabbard, and some with hands in prayer, and some with shields bearing the Templar's cross. Some with their ladies also cross-legged, lying beside them, their robes fixed forever in straight, stiff folds. The numerous families whose coat of arms bear the scallop shells or George's cross bespeak the Crusades, and even in today's inns exists at the sign of the Sacred's head. Yet the Crusades seem not to have been penetrated so deeply into the English consciousness as one might expect. They inspired no monument of national history. No one emerged in the 19th century giants to do for the Crusades what Stubbs or Froudeau or Freeman did for their special fields. All the basic scholarship has been done by the French, nor was any great literary tradition born of these Eastern adventures apart from the rather foolish medieval metrical romances celebrating Richard's dining on the roasted saccharine, or his rescued by Blondel the minstrel. Indeed, the English-speaking people know the Crusades chiefly in the rose-colored versions of Scott's Talesmen, the only outstanding work of fiction that inspired in all of English literature. Partly this lack due to the fact that England's real energies during the crusading epoch were taken up in the struggles between the Saxon and Norman, between nobles and kings, and between crown and church. The figure of Richard alone absorbs most of England's crusading traditions and glory, yet he was hardly an Englishman. His queen never set foot in England, and he himself spent no more than 7 months of his 12 years' reign in the country whose crown he wore. It was Palestine that made him into an English hero. What did England know of him as a king, or a towering, red-headed, sword-rattling apparition with a furious temper of the 𝖲చ్చి𝖾, apparition of the descended upon a country to be crowned, and to scrape into his treasury every intractable penny to finance his crusade? He was gone in such a hurry that England was hardly aware of him, except as a tidal wave of taxation that poured over them, and retreated only to over to them again when he had to be ransomed from prison of the emperor whom Leopold of Austria had surrendered him. Somehow those memories were blotted out by the glorious of his prowess in Palestine, as he hacked and slashed his way through the saccharine ranks with a sword in one hand and a battle-axe in the other. It was in Palestine that he became Richard the Lion-Hearted, and in Palestine that he was transformed from the quarrelsome, valorous, conscienceless son of Antioch and Anjou into England's first hero since Alfred. He was not, of course, the only king of England to go to Palestine as either a pilgrim or crusader. Twice the throne fell empty while its claimant was in the Holy Land. Richard's great-great-uncle, Robert Curhause, Duke of Normandy, the eldest son of the Conqueror, lost the English crown to his younger brother Henry I while away on the First Crusade. Richard's great-nephew, Edward Longshanks, had better luck. Though absent in Palestine, leading the Seventh Crusade when the king, his father, died, he was able to succeed the crown in his return, and reign for 20 years as Edward I, or Edward the Justinian. Richard's father, Henry II, his brother John, and John's son Henry III, all took the vow to go on the Crusades, but the first two were too busy fighting at home, and the last two declined to fight to make all the good vow. Others in the royal family substituted. William Longsword, whose father was a bastard brother of Richard the Lionheart, cut a great figure in the Crusade of St. Louis. So did Richard, Earl of Cornwall, brother of Henry III, perhaps the great English figure of the 13th century. Simon de Montfort, who led the barons' revolt against Henry III, commanded a crusade to Palestine early in his career. Countless others set out with their companies of knights, squires, foot soldiers, and some even with their wives, on ever fruitless quest to conquer our rightful heritage, God's land, whose title they had appropriated, yet were never able to make it good. It may be the Bible would never have been able to be a later time such a deep root in English body, had not English blood been shed on the land of the Bible over so many years. The English share in the First Crusade has commonly been overlooked. Yet according to the eyewitness chronicles of Raymond of Aguilar's, an English fleet of 30 vessels manned by English mariners played a vital role by supplying crusaders and supporting them from sea until they gained their first base at the Catcher of Antioch. Although William of Malmesbury, writing a generation later, says that but a faint murmur of the Asiatic affairs reached the ears of those who dwelt beyond the British Ocean, the murmur must have been louder than he thought, whether the English naval force was fired by enthusiasm for the Holy War, or was simply a group of dispossessed Saxons escaping from William's conquests. At any rate, it was collected in England, sailed under its leadership, and seized and held Cilicia, the port of Antioch, until the main body of the Crusades and Crusaders came down from Constantinople by land, until Antioch was taken by the English ship cooperating with the Genoese, held off attacks by the Saccharine fleet, and kept open the main supply lines to Cyprus. When the Crusaders were ready to march on Jerusalem, the English, having by then lost all about 9 or 10 of their ships, burned the remainder and joined the land forces, at which point they disappear from history. Perhaps it was their example, through all but ignored in the histories of the time, which determined Richard, 100 years later, to go by sea, or rather than follow the disastrous land march of his predecessors. If so, nameless men made a contribution and unhonored and unsung to development of the sea power that eventually carried England to empire. Meanwhile, Robert Curthose marched with the land army. Though Norman by birth and title, he was, as member of the newly established royal family, what might be called a first-generation Englishman. In fact, by the time he died, William of Malmesbury was speaking of him, Robert the Englishman. His followers on the crusade were chiefly Normans, Bretons, and Evgians, and the anonymous men from England, said to have accompanied him, were probably foot soldiers, for among 360 knights his train only a handful defeated Saxon lords were disaffected Anglo-Normans already at odds with the king. But if the English did not go along with Robert, they paid willy-nilly for his share in the crusade. In order to equip a force, he mortgaged the Duchy of Normandy to his unpleasant and brother Rufus for 5 years in return for 10,000 marks. Rufus, to raise a huge sum, imposed heavy taxes on every person in England, so that whole country groaned. Yet it was not so bad a bargain for Palestine. Robert, a footling fellow at home, pushed around his father and brothers, turned there, snatched a victory at Antioch from a near defeat, and saw himself slew the Red Lion, 𝖡𝗂essi𝖾, the Turkish chief. Although hardly the warrior type, being short, fat, and smiling, yet, according to a commentary account, Robert split a Turk into two from his head to his chest with one stroke of his sword. His valor and his generosity in sharing foods, arms, and mounts with other crusaders in the time of famine and tyranny were acknowledged by all. Indeed, he seems to have been open-handed and easy-going for those hard-bidden times, for he could not even rule his duchy effectively. If a weeping criminal was brought to him for justice, he would weep with him and set him free. Only in Palestine did Robert's career have its brief moment of glory. He came home to be victimized again by another of his sterner purposed family. Jerusalem was taken by the Crusaders in 1099, and Robert, as the only king's son among them, was the first to be offered the throne. He refused, for he still hoped to wear the crown of England. He left Palestine for home in the year 1100, but he was still on the way, an unknown handshot arrow that had felled Rufus in the New Forest and rid England of a ruler for whom not one good word has ever been said. Henry I was firmly seated in Rufus' place before Robert could get back. He promptly disposed of his elder brother's claim by shutting the returned crusader up in a prison for the rest of his life, and consoled him for the crown, so the chronicles say, by giving him a king's cast-off clothes. One other English group is said to participate in the First Crusade, although under the vague circumstances. Odorius Vitalis, whose chronicle is invaluable for this period, states that Edgar Etheling, last of the royal Saxon line, came to Laodicea in Syria, a town under Byzantine rule, and at the head of almost 20,000 pilgrims from England and other islands of the ocean, and persuaded the populace of the place to name his friend, Duke Robert, their commander. Who these pilgrims were, what part they played in the future development of the Latin kingdom, and would eventually become them, is nowhere further told. Poor Robert, always just short of a crown, at least achieved a brief, pompous glory in the only English drama composed on the subject of the Crusades, Thomas Heywood's 4 Prenatals of London, a rampaging fantastical play that was performed several times in the year 1600 to delighted Elizabethan audience at the Red Bull. Godfrey of Bouillon and other leading personages of the First Crusade, together with a company of imaginary knights, ladies, bandits, dragons, hermits, and priestesses, each generally appearing disguised as someone else, are tossed up in a series of purely fictional events. At the climax before the Holy City, English Robert speaks words that are much innocuous in the mouth of a crusader if he had appeared on the stage carrying a gun. Behold the wall of Jerusalem, which Titus and Vespasian once break down. From the turrets of ancient Jews, seen the worlds mustering on the plains. O princes, which of all your eyes are dry, to upon this temple now destroyed. Yonder did stand the great Jehovah's house. There was an ark, the shewbread, Aaron's rod, sanctum sanctorum, and tribunum. Now in that holy place where God's cells was present, pagans dwell, false gods are reared, and each temple idols theirs, and who else could abstain from tears? There is no mention of the holy sepulchre of the cross. Instead, the holy synonyms are Jehovah's house, or the temple, the ark. For already on the influence of the English Bible, Jerusalem was thought in terms of the Old Testament rather than the New. But Heywood, it is well to remember, was farther away from the First Crusade than we are from Heywood. In fact, so were the Crusaders from thoughts of Jehovah's house, that it was from their throats that the first sinister hep became the signal for the Jewish pogroms from their day, through Hitler's or through the Jewish tradition. Though armed with the sword of the Maccabees, in the words of Pope Urban, the Crusaders struck their first blows at the people of the Maccabees before they even left Europe. Every Jewish community on their path was put to the sword by the Christian warriors who could not wait for the end of the journey to bathe in the hands of blood. In part, these mass massacres were an anticipatory lunge at the infidel in the person of the Jews, who were the most convenient victims. The more so is rumored that they had devilishly inspired the Turkish persecution of Christians in the Holy Land. Partially, also, the pogroms were an opportunity to loot, and always a powerful motive among the Crusaders. Popular hatred of the Jews was not particularly active as sentiment until inflamed by the Holy Wars. Medieval men's almost superstitious dread and detestation of the heretic, a person outside the church, was one component. Another was a common feeling against the person whom money is owed. Usury, the lending the money at the interest, was practiced by the Jews in the Middle Ages because the guild system excluded them from other forms of livelihood, and because of their own law, while forbidding usury among themselves, permitted it toward non-Jews, and because usury, although Christian law forbade it among Christians, was necessary to the community. Ultimately, when the rise of capitalism and a money economy made it more necessary, Christian scruples relaxed sufficiently to permit the practice of usury by themselves. But during the Middle Ages, it was largely confined to the Jews, and though it then provided them with a crown, lucrative source of revenue. Only practical considerations against milking the cow dry limited the share of the crown could take from the Jews. In theory, they had property rights, but in practice these meant nothing, for the Jew was not allowed to bring a charge against Christian, and thus his position depended solely on the pleasure and protection of the sovereign. The more the sovereign encouraged Jewish usury, the more the people hated the Jews. During the crusading era, they learned of the violence of practice under the banner of the cross was a simple way to wipe out debt and seize Jewish gold with impunity. By the time of the Second Crusade, in 1146, his preachers were vying against the Jewish race in general, and the first recorded accusation of ritual murder was brought in 1144 against the Jews of Oxford. By that time, the Third Crusade of 1190, the association of the crusade and the pogrom was automatic, and the killings began immediately on Richard's coronation, though not at his order. Once started, they spread in waves from London to all the cities which the Jews lived, until the final ghastly climax at York, where the only Jews to escape slaughtered by mob, those slew their wives and children, then died from their own hand. Crusaders preparing for departure, and friars who incited the mob against the enemies of Christ were, according to all accounts, the leaders in these attacks, which had made a deep impression, for the chronicles describe them at length with genuine horror. Some of the proprietors were punished by Richard's ministers, and though no further attacks, feeling against the Jews was fed by the episode. Eventually, a century later, another Crusader king, Edward I, preferring to take everything at once instead of continuing to squeeze a source that was drying up, expelled the Jews from England, and subsequently to the crown the property they were forced to leave behind. In some way, men of the Middle Ages were able to disassociate their minds of contemporary Jews from the ancient Hebrews. The archetype of the warrior patriot, to both whom Richard the Lionheart and Robert Bruce were compared by their great admirers, was Judas Maccabeus. In fact, it was their great captains and kings among the Hebrews, not their prophets, who particularly appealed to the male mentality and the age of chivalry. Among the 9 worthies of history, 3 Pam, 3 Jews, and 3 Christian men, whose figures so often appear carved over church doors or embroidered in tapestry, the 3 Jews were represented by Joshua, not Moses, David, and Judas Maccabeus. Richard may not have been a Maccabee in valor, strength, and strategy, but not in motive. He fought for fun, not for liberty, that is, in Palestine. The rest, perhaps 90% of his adult life, he spent fighting up and down France against his father or the French king or some other feudal rival. But all this is forgotten in the brighter memory of his crusade. The fable agreed upon as regards of Richard is that sort of second King Arthur, which he was anything but. However, he prided England with a legend, and with a fleeing for the Holy Land as a locus of its legend. So that for his time, and the 100 years what followed, Englishmen could say that when I am dead and opened up, ye shall find Palestine lying in my heart, in the paraphrase of what Queen Mary said of Calais. Of the Second Crusade, little need to be said. It was an ingenious failure, which, according to the contemporary judgment, though it could not relive the Holy Land, yet it could be called unfortunate, as to serve the people heavenward martyrs. Few English joined it because of the population were engaged in 17 years alternate between Matilda and Stephen and their partisans. When their successor, Henry of Anjou, succeeded to the throne in 1152, the immediate task of bringing order to the unsettled kingdom absorbed all his energies. He contented himself with placing alms boxes in all the churches for contributions in aid of the Templars, and later imposed a levy ad sustentium 𝖡κυρισίं tere, amounting to 2 pence in the pound for the first year, after a penny in the pound for each of the 4 years thereafter. After Becket's murder in 1170, Henry himself had to vow a 3 years' crusade as the price of absolution for his share of guilt in the century's most celebrated crime. But the greater task of consulting the sovereignty of England, while constantly harassed by dynastic feuds in France, caused him to put off his departure from year to year. After Becket's murder in 1170, Henry himself had to vow a 3 years' crusade as the price of absolution for his shared guilt in the century's most celebrated crime. But the greater task of consolidating sovereignty over England, while constantly harassed by the dynastic feuds in France, caused him to put off his departure from year to year. He took a crusader's vow, but it is doubtful if he ever seriously intended going, for Henry was working king whose real interest was at home rather than dashing off after glory in the east. The immediate cause of the Third Crusade was Saladin's capture of Jerusalem from the Franks in 1178. A shudder ran through Europe, it said, as though news was led that the Holy City had again fallen to the infidel. Pope Urban II, who died shortly after, was popularly supposed to have died of grief. Even Henry felt the event keenly, and this time began active preparations to go on a crusade that the new Pope, Gregory VIII, was preaching. So great the response was, the king, nobles, and knights were taking the vow right and left, until, says 𝖲𝗅𝖾իս𝗒𝗂, it was no longer a question of who would take the cross, but who had not yet taken it. He reports, too, that it became custom to send a distaff wool, token of a woman's role, to prod reluctant warriors. 𝖲ฉิ𝖾իս𝗒𝗂 was the supposed author of Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, an eyewitness account, along with Bodaine's history, most valuable and redeemable of the records of the Third Crusade. Since modern scholars have discovered that there was no such person as 𝖲ฉิԼիսતુ𝗂, or as if there was, he did not write that chronicle. It would refer to hereafter as the sacred of IIR. One outcome of the fate of the far-off Jerusalem, England's first income tax, devised by Henry II to meet the cost of the expedition. Crusaders were exempt, but everyone else had to pay a tenth of all rents and movables. Each man was to assess himself, and he was suspected of underestimating his income. A third But if he was suspected of underestimating his income, a jury of his parish was to decide his true worth. The Saladin tithe, it was called, was a high purpose, was regarded, says Roger of the Fendover, as a violent extortion, which veiled the vice rhapsody of under the name of charity, and alarmed the priesthood as well as the people. Taxes were never popular. Despite the urgency of the crusade was held by the unending family feuds between Henry and his rebellious sons and the French king, Philip Augustus, who never forever making and breaking combinations against one another. In the midst of these feuds, worn out at 56, unhorsed out of the field of battle by his own son, Henry died in July 1189. The rampaging Richard was king. He had taken the cross 2 years earlier. Within a fortnight of the News of Jerusalem's fall, now he could be held back no longer. Unlike his father, he was unconcerned with the responsibilities of kingship or with England as a kingdom. A statistic gave him an opportunity to indulge in the grand lifestyle, ruined passion for battle, adventure, and glory. The Crusades offered all of this with chivalry's greatest gauge, a renowned and valiant enemy, and a salvation for his soul. He sped to England to be crowned and to organize some sort of regency for the period of his absence, and above all to fill his treasury. In an unexampled orgy of taxation and extortion, he set about extracting money by every known method, with some original devices of his own. He dismissed his father's ministers and put it out of the high offices of the church and state for public sale. He sold every title that needed confirming, every castle in dispute, and every fief of the crown that could find a rich enough claimant. All things were for sale with him: powers, lordships, earldoms, sheriffdoms, castles, towns, manors, and such like. For those who did not want the favors or the property badly enough to buy them, he collected the fines or without reason, jailed others, and forced them to buy their liberty and require payment of security for estates or cash for remission of vows. While Baldwin, Archbishop of Canterbury, and his invaluable Archdeacon Gladius Cambernius went down and up England, preaching the crusade and gathering recruits, Richard's ministers were even busier, ranking in fines, bribes, and presents. When it was put to the king that his methods were questionable, he only laughed abruptly and says, "I would sell London if I could find a buyer." Within 4 months, having scraped in every penny that was loose or could be pried loose, he was gone, taking with him the most valuable and loyal ministers, including Archbishop Baldwin and his father's prime minister, Ranulph Glanville, whom both were to die in Palestine, as well as his new justiciar, Hubert Waller. His father, shrewd by far, would have left men he could trust behind him to hold things together until his return. But Richard never thought of that. It was a mistake, and for his last year in Palestine had not been punctuated by the reports of John's usurpation, and his purpose had not been weakened by an agony of indecision, whether to go or to stay. He might have taken Jerusalem after all. Theoretically, each knight who joined the ranks was responsible for equipping himself and whatever number of squires and foot soldiers went in personal train. But Richard, though he may have had no head for governing, was not an irresponsible soldier, and his enormous appetite for money was for the sole purpose of ensuring that he could equip, supply, maintain an efficient force far from the home over a period of a year or more that would win him a victory over Saladin that he dreamed of, but that he may have also had in a mind to make a greater show of the pomp and power that haughty Philip and Duke Leopold of Austria is not unlikely. But above all, he was determined to not repeat the disastrous experience of the earlier overland expeditions, which, by attempting to live off the land, had antagonized the populace along their way and had to fight their way through, losing thousands by the battle and starvation before they ever reached Palestine. Richard wanted no taste of the scorched earth policy of the Turks, but it was required vast fund to transport an army by sea, while feeding it the while. The pipe rolls of the time reveal the methodical planning that went into assembling the fleet. The Sheriff of London, Henry of Cornhill, for example, renders an account of some of the £5,000 received from the King's Constable was spent. This, of course, represented only a small part of the whole. Richard also requisitioned in every city in England 2 palfreys and 2 additional sumpter horses from every manor of the king's own, 1 palfrey and 1 sumpter horse. For more than a year was spent in France and Sicily recruiting more men and ships and reaching a settlement with Philip of the 2 kings' mutual mistrust. It continued to gall the French king that wherever they went, Richard dazzled all eyes. Who could but admire this tall figure whom I.R.R. describes, clad in a rose-colored surplice, embroidered in solid silver crescents on his auburn hair, a hat of scarlet embroidered with many colored birds and beasts. At his side, gold-handed sword in a scabbard of wool and gold. Indeed, he seemed the very mirror of chivalry as he vaulted astride the faultless Spanish charger wearing a gold bride, trappings of gold and scarlet, spanges in saddle, chased with the 2 golden lions. In the spring of 1191, the entire army and fleet was assembled. After questioning additional galleys plus 2 years of supply of wheat, barley, and wine, his sister, Queen Joanna's gold plate, Richard was ready for the departure in April. Philip having gone on ahead in March, it was an imposing array of 219 ships, the greatest naval force of men of the day ever witnessed, that set sail with banners flying and trumpets sounding across the Mediterranean for Palestine. In the fleet were 39 war galleys, long and slender fighting vessels, powered by 2 tiers of oars, 24 huge busses, or navis maximi, with 3 tiers of oar, which carried 40 knights and 40 foot soldiers and 40 horses, all within their equipment, and a year's provision for men and beasts. In 156 smaller vessels carrying half of the complement of the busses, they sailed in a wedge formation of 8 squadrons, with 3 ships in the front row and 6 in the last, so arranged that a man could be heard from ship to ship, and a trumpet's call from squadron to squadron. In the lead sailed Johanna and Berengaria, whom the Queen Mother had brought to Messina for Richard to marry, and all he did not get around to celebrating the wedding till they stepped off in Cyprus. The king and his enchaîné guarded the rear. How many sailed with Richard on that grand and tragic venture? Medieval chroniclers have explained disregard for the figures, and forever speaking in the terms of the multitudes and the countless numbers, of asking rhetorically who can count them, or giving up utterly with all-embracing generalization that there was not a man of influence or renown there. IRR puts 10,000 in Richard's force at the capture of Messina, a figure that fits the known complements of the 200-odd vessels. In addition, Archbishop Baldwin sailed independently with a small force of 200 knights and 300 foot soldiers, and an unknown number of English mariners joined the fleet of Norsemen and Flemings, a total of 12,000 according to the contemporary records that have gone to relieve the Latin kingdom early in 1189, before Richard was king. No figures exist for the population of England at this time, but the demographic experts figured that the population was about 2 million in the decade of Richard's crusade. This would mean, if one assumes that between 10 and 20,000 English took part in some time in the Third Crusade, that approximately 100 men at the highest, 102 at the lowest, went to Palestine. According to an old rel of the noblemen's arms and knights at Ware with KRI at 𝖡చ్చి𝖾ι테𝗂유𝖾, every county of England supplied men for Richard's ranks, and many came from Wales. A very large proportion never returned. IRR mentions among the casualties of the combined armies during the first 2 winters in Palestine 6 archbishops and patriarchs, 12 bishops, 40 counts, and 500 noblemen, and a vast number of clergy, and his usual innumerable multitude of others. Most died of illness in the festering camp before Acre. In the fierce battles that followed after Richard took the city and went on to challenge the Legions' might, many were captured and killed by the enemy. A true figure for the combined armies impossible to arrive at, because the groups of crusaders from every part of Europe had been incoming ever since the fall of Jerusalem. Some stayed and some died. Some went home, and the number of mustered from the local Christian forces of Antioch, Tyre, and other principalities shifted with the intrigues of their leaders. Perhaps the estimate of Bohidin, Silian's chronicler, which put the Christian army before Acre at 5,000 knights and 100,000 foot soldiers, is near as truth as any. It is a proportion of 1 horseman to 20 foot is reasonable, although the higher losses among the foot reduced the proportion at the end of nearly 10, or even 1 in 5. Certainly over half the Christian force was lost by the time the Third Crusade was over. At the very last battle before Richard's departure, when he ordered every man who could fight to follow him. He could muster, according to IRR, only 500 knights and 2,000 shield-bearers whose lords had perished. When he last sailed at home, it was in a single galley that could have not carried more than 50 souls, although admittedly others had gone on ahead. To attempt to guess the proportion of England's population saw service in Palestine, given the general lack of reliable sources, is foolhardy. All one can say is that fewer than 1% went, of only a fraction ever came home. When Richard arrived in Palestine in June the 3rd, the Third Crusade was bogged down inside the walls of Acre in a futile siege that had already lasted a year. If the besieged were so badly off, or so the besiegers, cut off from the rest of the country, sunk into squalor and disease over the half-crowded camp, reduced to eating their own horses that had died of starvation, or playing fortunes in gold for the carcasses of a stray cat. Unable to storm the city or give up the siege, dulled by debauchery with the hordes of the camp followers, the Crusaders had lapsed into a rank and static misery that seems to smell in the pages of the Chronicles. Even the arrival in March 1191 of the French under Philip with fresh supplies did not succeed in stimulating the camp to more than a half-hearted activity that quickly subsided. Not until the arrival of Richard, who had stopped the conquer and attacked Cyprus along the way, was the camp finally galvanized into full-scale action. Richard reached Acre in June, and in 4 weeks the city, which had withstood 9 battles and hundreds of skirmishes and nearly 3 years' siege, capitulated. This is not to say the victory was Richard's alone, but without his fierce fighting spirit beating them on to the last effort of the Crusaders would have never breached the walls. Though bedridden and shaking from a quadrant ache, malaria, most from the moment of his arrival, Richard directed the battle from his litter, and when the Christians fell back again, and hailed under the darts and arrows from the Turks, he had himself carried to the front on a mattress, from which his great voice thundered and goaded the soldiers to a last and successful attempt. A truce and the exchange of prisoners were arranged with Saladin, of which conditions were to be fulfilled at the stated intervals over a 3-month period. But when Saladin kept delaying the fulfillment of his part, Richard, without consumption, slaughtered more than 2,000 Muslim prisoners. This ruthless act, which appalled even his own army, had provoked the shudders of horror and righteous indignation among latter-day historians. Ever since they have discovered that Richard was not entirely the privat chevalier of romance and chivalry that his reputation supposed, the pseudo-starchy school had been at him with open claws, tearing the part of what is left his reputation. The author of IRR, who worshipped the king and said he had valor of Hector, the imagination of the Achilles, and the liberty of Titus, the eloquence of Nestor, and the prudence of Ulysses, that he was the equal of Alexander and not the inferior to Roland. But later historians tend to picture him rather as a remorseless, kindless villain. He was probably not a pleasant or lovable character. None of the Planglets were, but a great soldier and a great commander he certainly was. He possessed that one quality without nothing else in a commander counts, the determination to win. To this, everything else, mercy, moderation, and tact, was sacrificed. The avarice that so horrifies his critics was not simply greed, it was a quartermaster greed for his army. His massacre of the prisoners was not simple cruelty, but a deliberate reminder to Saladin that to keep faith with the good terms agreed on was the great opponent understood and respected. The English king was, in fact, only Frank Saladin had any respect for. And he once said, if I should be fated to lose the Holy Land, I'd better lose it to Melek Rick than to any other. Yet he did not take Jerusalem. Why? The blocked-up crusades and the heat and diseases, the difficulty of supplying the army, and adapting tactics to use on the fertile fields of France to hostile hills and deserts of Palestine, well, all these were encountered by the First Crusade. What they did not have to contend with, as Richard did, was the great general in command of the enemy. Saladin was on home ground, and he would call on armies from all sides of Palestine, and he was not himself weakened by the enemies at his rear. But what had really defeated Richard was the defined purpose of his own allies, whose overriding concern was their own mutual rivalry. Conrad, Marquis of Styria, defected to the enemy. The French king pulled out either because he could not stand being in the shadow of Richard's glory, or because he was always intended to get at home and first grab Richard's French possessions. His defection was not an unmixed loss, for as Sidion's brother said, Richard was hindered by the king of France like a cat in a hammer tied to his tail. The 15 months from the fall of Acre in July 1191 to Richard's departure in October 1192 was spent in pushing down the coast against repeated enemy raids until Jaffa, the base for the march against Jerusalem, could be reached. In pauses for negotiation in the side campaigns against Ashkelon and Darum, and two fruitless attempts to take the holy cities in the hill. The southward march from Acre down the old Roman coast road depended on meeting the supply fleet at frequent intervals. Richard planned the march with great care. The army, consisting of fine main corps of Templars, Bretons, Angevins, Normans, and English, and lastly Hospitallers, was divided to the three longitude groups. Furthest inward marched the infantry to protect the whole against the frequent ambushes of the enemy sweeping down from the hills. In the middle were the cavalry, the nearest sea, the heavy burdened baggage train. The Royal Standard of England, borne on a covered wagon drawn by 4 horses, moved in the center, but the king himself generally rode up and down, inspecting the arrangements and keeping order. Because of the heat, he confined the march to the early morning, covering only 8 or 10 miles a day and resting over a full 24 hours every other day. The sole place was necessitated by the midsummer heat and the weakened condition of the army, and the heavy losses of the pack animals sustained at Acre. Half of the infantry had to be carried the baggage and tents on their backs, changing places with the fighting infantry for relief. For protection against the constant shower of arrows from the enemy, the crusaders wore thick felt cassocks over their mailed shirts, and Bohun tells of the awe of which the Turks saw the Franks march along, unhammered, 5 or 10 arrows apiece sticking out from their backs. Under the burning rays of the sun, many dropped dead from the heat, and others fainted and had to be transported by sea. At an evening's halt, a designed herald stood up in the midst of the host and cried, "Sanctum Sepulchrum Adivuna." Help us, Holy Sepulchre. The host took up the cry, repeating it 3 times, stretching to the heavens, and weeping copiously, and according to IR, deriving relief and refreshment from the ceremony. As they crept down the coast, they knew that each day's march brought them closer to the pitched battle that Saladin must launch if he were to stop them from reaching Jaffa. Advanced cavalry units of the Turks pricked at the slow phalanx, trying to tease them into battle, it being Saladin's strategy to divide and scatter the Christians over the plains, where his rushing horsemen could cut them down. Richard was determined to keep a solid formation that would protect the supply wagons and force the Turks into battle at close quarters. Nerves were strung evermore as tensely as they marched, each man sensing in his bones the silent gathering of the vast hordes behind the hills. It took Richard's sternest discipline to prevent the overtaught corps commanders from dashing out to engage the enemy prematurely. At last, 11 miles above Jaffa, at a place called Arsuf, the moment came. Unable to contain themselves, the Hospitallers broke ranks and charged the Turks. King Richard, says IR, on seeing his army in motion, flew his horse through the Hospitallers and broke into the Turkish infantry, who were astonished at his blows and at those of men who gave the way right and left. But they regrouped and massed for a charge. All over the face of the land you could see well-ordered bands of Turks, myriads of banners and mailed men, who appeared to be more than 20,000. They swept back down swifter than eagles, turning the air black and dust breezed by their horses, howling at their battle cries and sounding the blast of trumpets. The king was wounded by a spear thrust in the left side. Kneeling on the one knee, with his spears advanced while between the ballista, a dart-throwing engine, the wheels was brought into action. Although the battle raged all day, the Turks never broke through, and at last they withdrew over the ground, sifted with blood and strewn from corpses. Now the armies had met and tested each other's strength in open combat. After this battle, Saladin realized that he could not halt the Crusaders' march, but by retreating and fleeing for a time he could outstay them. He withdrew the garrisons from all the fortresses to the south and even down to the Ashkelon, for he had no desire to leave each other to be another Acre. Only Durham, the last stronghold on the way to Egypt, was left garrisoned, but Richard took it in a 4-day siege. From this point on, when a united, all-out effort to take Jerusalem might have been succeeded, the crusade began to fall apart. First, the French insisted on remaining in Jaffa to fortify its walls and essentially enjoy the luxuries of the city life after hardships of the field. When the instance of others finally failed, an attempt on Jerusalem was made in the new year. The Duke of Burgundy retreated within the sight of the city and ultimately took himself off altogether. Other groups fell on the return to Acre or to join the traitorous Conrad Ture. Even the Templars and Hospitallers consulted against taking Jerusalem, lest they be left alone afterwards to fight the surrounding Turks. Richard himself, tormented ever since Philip's desertion by the thought of what his rival, his brother John, might doing behind his back, was in a hurry to return to his kingdom, unless there be no kingdom left to return to. This worry and growing realization that no united effort could probably ever be wrung from the divided army put a mood to the end of the war by negotiated truce. Throughout the winter and into the spring of 1192, the conferences dragged on with proposals and counter-proposals concerning the possession of Jerusalem and the various coastal cities and crusader castles, even including Richard's absurd and cynical suggestion that his sister Joanna marry Saladin's brother, and that they can rule Jerusalem between them. The courageous and diplomatic Saladin kept talks and projects by skilled speechcraft and constant flow of gifts, a magnificent Spanish horse for Richard, a scarlet tent, fresh fruits or cooling snow brought from the mountains, and even 7 camels richly caparisoned, and a skilled physician to minister to the king. Meanwhile, messengers from England, with reports of John's depredations up and down the kingdom, implored Richard to return. He decided on a final effort for Jerusalem in June 1192, but again united counsels could not be obtained, and bitterly the king gave up. As he turned back from the great goal which offered so much effort, blood, and treasure had been vainly spent, a knight turned his steps into a hilltop from which the towers of Jerusalem could be seen. But Richard veiled his face with a cloth, saying, "Blessed Lord God, I pray thee not to let me see the holy city, that I could not deliver from the hands of thy enemies." The validity of remaining in Palestine was now obvious. Richard was preparing to sail from Acre when the news came that Saracens had surrounded Jaffa, where a small force of Christians was holding out in imminent danger of death. It was almost as if the fates had been taking hand and amid the bitter humiliation of a brave man, for in the battle of Jaffa, Richard performed such feats of arms and won glory such as ranks of tongues of all men. The memory of his exactions was dimmed by the reports of his valor, and when 3 years later Eleanor moved heaven and earth to rise the gigantic ransom demanded by Richard, captor in their pride the lion-hearted king, Iris counted on the relief of Jaffa, written perhaps that very night, seems almost to burst with pride and ecstasy in the battle of the king's mighty deeds. Richard says he interrupted all the counsels and cautions. "As God lives, I will be with them and give them all the aid I can." Already on board a ship, he turned the helm southward and ran his galley onto the beach at Jaffa, waded ashore and up to his middle in the waves of the head and small landing party about 80 knights and 300 crossbowmen. Himself armed with an arbalist, which he soon changed for his fierce sword, and his companions dashed forward against the Turks, who covered the beach and soon pushed them back. After a terrific battle, the town was taken and the Christian garrison saved, but the Turks, ashamed, had been put to rout by a small number, set in a new force to take Richard by surprise as he slept in his tent. A last-minute warning shout, "To arms," woke the king. God of all virtues, lives there a man who would not be shaken by such a sudden alarm? Oh, who could fully relate to the terrible attacks of the infidels? The Turks at first rushed on the whoring yells, hurling their javelins and shouting their arrows. The king ran across the ranks and exhorted every man to be firm and not to flinch. The Turks came in like a whirlwind again and again, making the appearance of attack that our men be induced to give way. When they were close up, that they served their horses off in another direction. When the kings and his knights who were put on horseback receiving this, put spurs into their horses and charged in the middle of the enemy, upsetting them right and left, piercing a large number through the body with their lances. What a terrible combat then waged! A multitude of Turks rushed towards the royal standard of the lion, and they would rather slay the king than 1,000 others. But such was the energy of courage that seemed to be rejoicing at having found the occasion to display itself. His sword, which shone like a lightning, cut down men and horses alike, cleaving them to the middle. All he fought in IRR tells at times he wielded a sword in one hand and a lance in the other, how he carved a path for himself like a reaper with a sickle, and how he inspected such terror in the Turks to create a panic among them in their rush from his way, and how he saw the noble Earl of Leicester fallen from his horse and fighting bravely on foot, and how he spurred him and replaced him on his horse, and how he snatched Ralph de Manibon from the enemy and restored him to the army, and how Saladin in the midst of battle sent him 2 fresh horses in honor of courage, and how the king said he would accept any number of horses from an enemy was worse than Saladin, so great was his need in them. How at last the king, fierce, extraordinary king, returned safe and unhurt to his friends. His person stuck all over with javelins, like a deep pierced by the hunters, and the trappings of his horse they were thickly covered with arrows. And when Saladin asked his crestfallen warriors why they had not taken Melek Rick, they answered, "In truth, my lord, there was never such a knight since the beginning of the world. To engage with him is fatal, and his deeds are beyond human nature." And a 3 years' armistice was now signed, leaving Jerusalem and the hill country to the sacraments, but restoring the Church of the Sepulchre and the pilgrims' right of free access to it to the Christians was also retained. The coastal plain and the ports of Tyre and Jaffa. 3 parties of crusaders went to see the holy city, but without Richard, who, as if he could not go as a conqueror, would not go at all. The Lionheart sailed away, but the legend of his might renowned by word among the Arabs. If a horse shelled at a noise in the bushes, it was believed that the spirit of Melek Rick had frightened them, and a crying child was quieted by the answering, "Hush, England is coming." One of the effect of the Crusades of England was upheavals in the tenure caused by so many knights mortgaging their lands for cash to outfit themselves. The king was not the only one to go to extremes for monies. One John de Camoes sold his wife and her child's. A certain Andrew Astley sold his whole estate to the Abbey of Colm in Warwickshire for 320 marks sterling. Others mortgaged their lands, usually to rich abbeys, for 300 or 400 or 7 years. If they survived the wars to return home, they were too often too impoverished to redeem their property and were forced to spend out their lives as poor brethren in a monastery. The 16th century researchers of Leland and Camden demonstrate archives and local parish records turned up as fact about the Crusades. There was one Osborne Gilburn who was excommunicated for abducting 2 nuns as the price of the absolution to undertake 3 years' crusades in the Holy Land, during which he could wear no shirt or knight's habit, nor could he ever have his life entered in a nunnery again. Roger de Marbury was a rarity who went twice to Palestine in the years of the Second Crusade and survived capture by the Saracens as well. Anyone so fortunate was sure to be make sure the subject of romantic adventures, and Roger was said to have intervened in a mortal combat between a dragon and a lion, having slain the dragon, and so won the gratitude of the lion, that it followed him all the way home to England. His son Nigel went with the Richard on the Third Crusade, and made another prisoner by the Saracens was Hugh de Hatton, who escaped after 7 years' captivity and made his way home in rags. Learning from a shepherd who did not recognize him that he had been given up for dead, Hugh entered his castle to meet what welcome we do not know. The story leaves him at the threshold, another line of long-lost warriors who had never been retreating incognito ever since Ulysses came back from Troy. Banishment was a frequent reason for going off to the Holy Wars. The doughty folk Fritz Ryan so angered the Prince John in his chess game that John hit him over the head with a chessboard, and whereupon folk retreated with a blow that almost killed him bad temper. Promptly banished from the court, he set off for Palestine, but was driven by storms to the Barbary coast, where he too was taken by prisoner by the Sassanids. His captivity appears to have been a pleasant one, for he is reputed to have enjoyed the love of a noble lady called Adorn during his stay in the Sultan's domain. Eventually he made his way to join Richard's army at the siege of Acre. In the noble company also was William 𝖡𝗂essikiL, famous for saving Richard from the capture during the hunting prey surprised by an enemy raid. William shouted, "I am the king," and was carried off as a prisoner, but fortunately for the last things Richard did in Palestine was to exchange 10 Turks for his gallant friend. Even the wicked John, when he was king after Richard's death, took the cross in the faded ink of Magna Carta. It can be read in how he promised to adjust all property claims made on him before we undertook the crusade. But the stern barons, not trusting his intentions, also forced him to promise good their claims right away. If penitence we tarry at home, we do not make our pilgrimage. John, of course, did tarry, but his younger son Richard, Earl of Cornwall, was determined to go as his namesake, Richard I had been. The only responsible man at the court were a pack of French favorites, making a shambles of governments under the complicit eye of his incomplete brother, Henry III. Earl Richard felt unable to depart as long as their heir apparent, but as soon as his son was born to a king, he set out for Palestine. Everyone tried to dissuade him, including the Pope, who urged him to buy a remission vow. The papal solicitude was no doubt influenced by the fact that Richard, who owned the tin and lead mines of Cornwall, the vast timberlands, was the richest prince in Europe. But the Earl would not sell his vow. Instead, he sold his woods to raise necessary funds. When he took his leave, says William of Tyre, the people wept, for he was a person who minded the public welfare. Whereon he had told them that even if he had not made the vow, he would go sooner to witness the mysteries that come along with the realm. With him went the valiant William Longsword, of Earl of Salisbury, later killed in the Crusade of Egypt, 7 barons, some 50 or 60 knights, in the usual company of bow and lancemen. However, they landed at Acre in October 1240. They found a truth rebellion among Franks and Muslims, and later embroiled in the usual war between the caliphates of Egypt and Syria. As a term of truth that had not been fulfilled, Earl Richard, in the footsteps of his late uncle, marched for Jaffa, but was met with a peace officer by the hard-pressing Sultan of Egypt, a stiff man to deal with, but Earl emerged out of the later negotiations with the best terms ever won by the Crusaders in treaty. Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem, and the most holy land were left to the Christians. Earl Richard returned to be hailed on every hand as deliverer of the sepulchre. He had joined in Palestine by Simon de Montfort, whose recent marriage to the king's sister has raged such a storm that he found it prudent to leave home for Palestine. Simon was to be called the second Joshua in battle, had recently, with the Crusaders' consistent animus against the Jews, expelled the descendants of Joshua from his borough of Leicester. He had not yet emerged as the great opponent of the royal tyranny, perhaps the only man to fight for the principle in all the bloody feuds between kings and nobles. From the conquest of the Tudors, although he left no marks on events in Palestine, his powerful personality and abilities must have been recognized by the local Franks as they offered him regency of the Latin kingdom during minority of its boy rule. But Simon felt greater longings in him and went home to make himself master of England before his ultimate defeat and brutal death. The end of the Crusade era was now drawing anear. Palestine had become a battleground for the new Islamic hordes. Carmasians and Kurds were pushed down, and from the north by the advancing Mongols, were followed soon by the Tartar Khans themselves. Within 2 years of Earl Conway's treacherous victories, Jerusalem was again lost. Tibur and Acre remained the last temples of Franks in Palestine. Subsequent crusades were directed at Egypt and the Barbary coast, where Mamluk dynasty ruled. The last organized efforts of the West were the two fruitless expeditions by the St. Louis of France, that drum filled the wind, as the Muslim poet called them. In the second of these, 1269-72, he was joined by the Prince Edward of England, who undertook the crusade, and the fulfillment and vow made him accomplish the overthrow of Simon de Montfort. On his arrival at Tunis, with 4 earls and 4 barons and about 1,000 men, Edward was disgusted to find that Lunas and the other princes had signed a treaty with the Sultan. Edward promptly sailed for Acre with his own men, where he raised an army of about 7,000 local Franks, but he accomplished nothing for more than the conquest of Nazareth and the revenge of the sacrilegious destruction of Christian shrines in that place. Struck down by the assassin's poisoned dagger, the prince was soon near death for months. Finally, too, he signed a truce, and for 10 years, 10 months, and 10 days after which he departed home, he found himself king in a rival. He was the last prince of the West to fight in Palestine. A letter reached Edward in 1281 from Sir Joseph de Cancy, a knight in the hospital of St. John, whom the king had commissioned to keep him informed of the news of the events that befell in the Holy Land. It tells of a battle Sir Joseph witnessed between the Saracens and the Mongol Tartars. It goes to lament, never in our remembrance was the Holy Land such poor state that it is this day, wasted by a lack of rain, difference, pestilence, and the Paynim, and we have seen a few soldiers of the Franks, or a little good counsel in it. He is sure, with the able generals and adequate supplies, the infidel could be driven out. He concludes by urging Edward to back and complete the conquest. By now the time had run out. Edward was engaged in conquering a nearer kingdom over the border, and he never returned to the east. The later popes had followed their own cause by Annunciation, which they had persuaded crusaders to buy back their vows and gold for the Vatican. When the Grand Master Templars came to Europe to beg for help against resurgent Mamluks, he was able to round up no more than a few hundred Italian mercenaries. Palestine was a lost cause. Exactly 100 years after Richard the Lionheart broke the walls of Acre, 2,000 Mamluks marched against the Crusaders' last city, and in 1291 Acre fell. The same year that Edward expelled the Jews from England, the last Christians were driven from Palestine.